Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the Summer of Gaming 2022. This is basically the stand-in for E3 this year. So it's all the middle of the year announcements of new games or existing games getting release dates or whatever the case may be. So I went ahead and watched most of the major events, and I also messed around with a few demos as part of the Steam Next Fest, so I'll be talking about those later on in the video. But until I get to the Steam Next Fest demos specifically, I will have some gameplay footage of both the Gloomwood demo, which was actually just the old version of the game that I've already covered in one of these videos, as well as gameplay footage of the updated demo for Trepang 2, which did change and was definitely more polished than the previous demo that I've covered. But I don't really have all that much new to say about it, other than the introduction of the dual wielding is pretty amusing. And the game is still shaping up very nicely, and I'm very much looking forward to the full release. So let's just go ahead and get things started with the first major event, which was the Summer Game Fest with Jeff Keighley, for which there really wasn't a whole lot that stood out. I mean, they started off with some gameplay of Street Fighter 6, which actually looks pretty solid. I mean, it's more Street Fighter, so you know it's at least going to be a decent fighting game. But Street Fighter has never really been my thing. It's not that I don't like the games, it's just that I haven't really played all that many of them. And the only one I really put any significant amount of time into so far has been Super Street Fighter 4. There's just always been other fighting games that I prefer, like Mortal Kombat especially, but also stuff like Samurai Showdown and Soul Calibur and such. So while it is nice to see them really leaning more into the street part of the Street Fighter name, and adding in things like the World Tour mode and giving the game rollback netcode to dramatically improve the online experience, as well as just generally giving the game a bit more personality and spice compared to most of the previous games in the series, it's not exactly something I'm going to be looking forward to picking up on day one. It might be something I pick up later on down the line when there's some sort of package deal with a bunch of the DLC included, because that's another thing that's been driving me up the wall with fighting games as of late, just the horrible value proposition on day one. There is no reason for a more casual fighting game player like myself to pick up a fighting game on day one before it has all of the DLCs out, because you'd just be spending a huge amount of money over time picking up all of the extra DLCs and such when you could just wait until they're all out and then pick it up then. I mean, hell, I got a copy of Street Fighter V in a Humble Bundle or something, and it didn't include any of the character passes, so now I have 5 season passes I need to pick up before I can consider the game, air quotes, complete, because even that isn't the entire DLC roster for Street Fighter V. I fully expect Street Fighter 6 to have basically the same amount of DLC, if not even more, so we'll just have to wait and see how that goes, but I'm probably not going to pick that up on day one. It'll certainly be after at least a character pass or two has come out and they have some sort of package deal, or if I get it in a Humble Bundle or something, I don't know. But you shouldn't necessarily mistake that for not actually wanting to play the game. I do actually want to play Street Fighter 6, it's just not exactly a priority. Moving on, we have Aliens Dark Descent, which apparently is a tactics game. You didn't really get that idea from the trailer. It looked more like a twin-stick shooter from what they were showing. But as it turns out, it's a real-time tactics game. So, a tactics game set in the Aliens universe? It actually could be pretty cool. We'll have to wait and see how that goes. Then we had the Callisto Protocol, which is the new game from some of the developers of Dead Space. And really the only reaction I had to that was, yep, that looks like Dead Space. And for those of you who don't really know how I feel about the Dead Space series, let me just put it simply, that's not a good thing. I do have plans to redux Dead Space 1 and 2 at some point, but it's very low priority. I really don't like those games. I don't like horror games in general. They just tend to bore the living shit out of me. And Dead Space was really no exception, so I imagine the Callisto Protocol will be more or less the same way. It's got nice graphics though, I'll give it that. Moving on, we had vertical slice single-player gameplay of the upcoming Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 2022. And I am really fucking tired of having to include the release year of something in the game's title because it's the exact same title as a previous game, but here we go. Irritating title aside, this is basically a reboot of Modern Warfare 2 from 2009, only not really having a whole lot of anything to do with that game, and instead just being a sequel to Modern Warfare 2019, which if you have not seen my review of that, it was a good game. It basically ushered in a new era of Call of Duty with a brand new engine that was far more capable than the one that they had been using, retooled gunplay that felt pretty fantastic, a huge amount of attention to detail, plenty of features for the PC version, crossplay to be able to play with consoles, etc., etc. It was the first Call of Duty game I had been actually looking forward to in many years at that point, and when it came out, it did have some issues, don't get me wrong, but it was overall a very enjoyable game. And then Black Ops Cold War and Vanguard happened. And all of the enthusiasm that the series had gained from Modern Warfare 2019 was basically lost with both of those games. So now we're at Modern Warfare 2 2022. And, I mean, it looks solid. It looks like Modern Warfare 2019, but with some different stuff in it. I certainly don't want to pay the $70 US asking price for it, because even though they're bringing it back to Steam, I really don't want to spend that much money on a Call of Duty game. So while I'll certainly take a look at the open beta when that rolls around, and I will certainly get the full game eventually, it'll require a pretty hefty price drop, so I really don't know when I will pick up the full game and do a full review of it. But for those of you who are wondering about Black Ops Cold War and Vanguard, because I haven't really done any videos on those other than a video on the beta for Black Ops Cold War, I do have copies of them. I'll review them eventually, but they are absolutely gigantic install sizes, so I need to free up some disk space first, because I simply don't have the space to install them right now. Although by the time I end up getting Modern Warfare 2 2022, hopefully I will have the disk space for them, because hopefully by then I will have built a new PC. I am planning on doing that between now and next year, because while my current rig has certainly served me well up to this point, it's finally at the point where the latest games are really forcing it to hit its limits in a way to where it's adversely affecting the gameplay experience, so I definitely need to be looking at upgrading. And whether fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, it means I am going to have to build an entirely new rig, because I would have to swap out basically every single component that I have, so there's really no point in just swapping out parts in the current rig. I would really need to build an entirely new one. And thankfully we're right on the cusp of a new generation of graphics cards and processors, and we just had a massive crash in the crypto market. So graphics cards and processors are becoming available at close to MSRP again, which is fantastic news. So hopefully I'll be able to pick up some fresh hardware pretty soon and build a beastly new rig that I will proceed to play basically nothing but 30-year-old games on, because that's how I roll. Anyway, I got sidetracked there. Let's get back to the Summer Game Fest stuff. The next thing we got was Flashback 2, and I think that Microids is dramatically overestimating how beloved the original Flashback is, because as far as I know, barely anybody remembers that game. It was a cinematic platformer in the style of something like Another World, or Out of This World, depending on what region you're in. And while people remember that game, and people remember the original Prince of Persia, those are about the only cinematic platformers that people actually remember. Not to mention, it's been about 30 years since the original Flashback released, so I really don't see Flashback 2 being all that much of a success, and it really doesn't help that the gameplay footage they showed didn't really inspire much confidence. I guess we'll just have to wait and see, though. I certainly know that it's not going to be my kind of thing. I will probably take a look at the original Flashback eventually, probably as part of a DW Plays video, because that is really not my kind of game at all. And I doubt I'll take a look at Flashback 2 at all, unless I get it in a Humble Bundle or something like that. So, don't really expect anything from Flashback 2 on my channel. Something you should expect from my channel, probably way later than it's even remotely relevant, though, is Witchfire, which is a first-person shooter I've been keeping an eye on for years now. And unfortunately, they decided to take it Epic Game Store exclusive. which means that it's basically off my radar because I refuse to buy anything on the Epic Game Store. Look, I get that that game has been in development for way too long and they probably really needed the money from that Epic Store exclusivity deal, but Epic Store exclusivity is about the fastest way to get me to stop caring about a particular game until it eventually comes out a year later or so on a platform that I actually use. Moving on, we had a couple of sci-fi horror games, Fort Solace and Routine, neither of which I care about. And we had The Rock show up and do a whole bunch of really lame advertising and eventually got shown a Black Adam trailer. And unfortunately for that, I am completely burned out on superhero stuff, so I don't even really want to mess around with the superhero games that I have, like Marvel's Spider-Man for PS4. I mean, hell, that's coming out on PC, so I should probably just play the PC version instead and get a better experience overall. But unfortunately, unless I was already invested in something, I really have absolutely no interest in any upcoming superhero movies or TV shows or anything like that. Moving on, we had a quick thing about upcoming Switch games, which we already knew about, so I'm not really going to talk about that. We had something for Fall Guys, which I don't care about at all. We had a CGI trailer for Stormgate, which is an upcoming real-time strategy game from some of the developers of Warcraft and StarCraft. And while it's nice to see a brand new franchise in real-time strategy games, I have a feeling it's not going to learn any lessons, and it's just going to try to go after the same exact market that StarCraft covers, and it's probably going to be an absolute failure because of that. Pro tip to any aspiring real-time strategy game developers out there. The vast majority of the real-time strategy game fan base is casual. If you focus on the competitive side of real-time strategy games, you are catering to an absolutely minuscule minority of the player base. And if you're catering to their wants and needs, then you're probably going to alienate the casual players because, frankly, we don't care about competitive play. We just want good single player, good skirmish, and some multiplayer that you can just hop into, have some nice casual fun with, and not have to worry about every single player just completely demolishing you because they play it on a competitive level. And considering that Stormgate is apparently going to be free to play, I can almost guarantee you that it's going to focus almost exclusively on the competitive side, and it's going to completely alienate the casual player base, which means that the game's probably going to flop. I guess we'll just have to wait and see, though. Moving on, we had a trailer for a game called High Water, and the only note I have for it is insert shrug here. Apparently, it was so bland that I really don't even have anything to say about it, and honestly, I can't even remember it off the top of my head, so that's definitely not encouraging. Then we had a bit where they talked about Replaced, which is that cyberpunk pixel art game that's been in development for quite a long time now. And they mentioned that the developers have been affected by the war in Ukraine, and thus they weren't able to bring anything to the show, so that's really unfortunate. Then there was American Arcadia, with the only thing I have to say about that is apparently just meh. And then Goat Simulator 3, which is also meh, but even worse. It's Epic Game Store exclusive, so I don't care. Then, of course, there's Marvel's Midnight Suns, which is that game from Firaxis that's apparently going to be basically Marvel XCOM, and not only am I burned out on superhero stuff, but I'm fully expecting that one to just be a mess. Then, of course, there's the Delicious Last Course DLC for Cuphead, and I still haven't picked up Cuphead and still haven't tried it out, but it's really not my kind of game, so I don't really care all that much. Then we had Neon White, which is a speedrunning first-person shooter with some roguelite elements. And the style of it looked kind of neat, but speedrunning shooters are really not my kind of thing either. It's just that specific subgenre of them doesn't really appeal to me very much. But I'm sure I'll pick it up and give it a try eventually. It's just waiting for a decent sale on it. Then we have Midnight Fight Express, which is an action game, and it looked kinda neat, but not really the kind of thing that I would go out of my way to pick up a copy of. And there was the inevitable bit about the upcoming Warframe expansion, which I really don't care about. The bit about a couple of games from the developers of Genshin Impact, and I don't care about those either because fuck gacha games. But regardless, it was Honkai Star Rail and Zenless Zone Zero, both of which I'm sure will be just as exploitative and ridiculous as Genshin Impact is. Then there was TMNT Shredder's Revenge, which is a beat-em-up game that actually looks kind of neat, and I will probably pick it up, but I'm not sure when. Probably when it goes on sale for a decent price. Then we had a really awful-looking CGI trailer for Super People, which I think is some sort of battle royale game. But let me put it this way. When the only thing that I remember about your trailer, other than it looked awful, was that it was painfully obvious whoever was making that trailer has absolutely no idea how shotguns work, because they had one guy gripping his support hand on the receiver as opposed to the pump of a pump-action shotgun. It really doesn't inspire confidence. Anyway, moving on. We have the Latin American Cultures expansion for Humankind, which is certainly cool. Always nice to see more content for something like that. We have One Piece Odyssey, which can go fuck itself with a cactus. And then there was the English voiceover teaser for the upcoming Soul Hackers 2. Now, it is cool that Soul Hackers is getting a sequel. It doesn't look like it has anything to do with the original, but that's not surprising. It's a Shin Megami Tensei game. They very rarely have sequels that actually have anything to do with their predecessors. But unfortunately, it was subject to the curse of anime English voiceovers, which is they generally are pretty bad. Thankfully, that hasn't really been all that much of a problem in a lot of the Japanese releases more recently, because most of them have included Japanese voiceovers as an option. So usually it's just you switch it over to the Japanese and you don't even worry about it from then on out. And usually if it's not already included in the game itself, then they'll have it as a DLC that is released for free, and you can just install that and not have to worry about it. But let's just say bringing attention to the English voiceovers was probably not a good idea for them on that. Anyway, let's continue moving on. We have Capcom Arcade Stadium 2. Cool. Nice to see that they are bringing a lot of arcade classics to more modern systems that just about anybody can get their hands on, as opposed to having to track down some big old arcade machine that is stupendously expensive and a pain in the ass to maintain. Then we had Super Mario Strikers Battle League, which is not remotely my thing, and Metal Hellsinger, which I have a bit about later on in this video when I talk about the Steam Next Fest demos, so I will leave anything I have to say about Metal Hellsinger until then. Then we had The Quarry, horror game, don't care, and Nightingale, open world survival craft game, don't care. We had Saints Row, the reboot, which apparently is also Epic Game exclusive, so I didn't really care much about that one to begin with, and now I care about it even less. Then we had Warhammer 40k Darktide, which is literally just Vermintide but 40k. I already played Vermintide 1 and 2 and didn't like either of them, therefore I really don't care about Darktide either. Then we had Layers of Fears, which is a really stupid title, but whatever. If you're a horror game fan, you'll probably get something out of it. I don't really care. We had Gotham Knights, which we've had bits and pieces of on and off for a while now, and again, completely burned out on superhero stuff, therefore I really don't care about Gotham Knights. And then they closed out the show by having Neil Druckmann walk out on stage and talk about a few things about The Last of Us, which included the first teasers of the upcoming TV show, which I really don't care about, as well as apparently a standalone Last of Us multiplayer game, which I really don't care about either, and The Last of Us Part 1, which is a remaster of The Last of Us, and it's coming for PS5 and PC. I really don't care. I already played The Last of Us, remastered specifically. It's fine. They didn't need to remaster it again. But apparently, instead of bringing us something new and kind of interesting, they just decided, nah, we're just gonna remake a remake. Because, I don't know, reasons, I guess. Meanwhile, I started The Last of Us Part 2 and got a few minutes in before I had to stop playing it for that time because I just got busy with something, and I have yet to go back to it. Honestly, I really haven't messed around with my PS4 much in the past several months. I basically would log on and add the PS Plus games to my account to make sure that I can get them whenever I want to. And I've run a few updates on some of the games I've had installed on, and of course some system updates, but that's pretty much it. And now with most of the PS4 and PS5 exclusives that would actually kind of draw me to the system coming to PC, I really have less and less reason to start up my PS4. I mean, I was working on Ghost of Tsushima, but I got about halfway through the game and just kind of stopped playing it and haven't gone back to it. And now I'm thinking that they'll probably release it on PC, which would ultimately eliminate the main problem I have with the PS4 version, which is the sub-30 frame rate. And hell, if it weren't for a handful of exclusives, I basically would have nothing to mess around with on my PS4 at this point, because a lot of the games I have for it have come out on PC. Hell, I wish they bring more of them to PC. I'd love to see Killzone on PC, because frankly, playing it on a controller is awful, and playing it with that insanely low FOV is even worse. Now, don't get me wrong, it is nice to see that Sony is starting to push a lot of their titles onto PC as well, because it seems like they're finally understanding PC gamers don't really care about PlayStation hardware, and they're not going to go out of their way to buy a PlayStation just so they can play maybe 2 or 3 games. So, releasing their games on PC is also a good thing. But there's just nothing in the Sony camp that really makes me want to even consider getting their new hardware. I mean, I have a PS4 and I barely use it, so why should I care about the maybe 2 games on PS5 that are even the slightest bit interesting right now, which are the remake of Demon's Souls, which is a remake of a PS3 game that I already have, as well as Returnal, which is a third-person shooter, and I would frankly rather play any first-person or third-person shooter on PC anyway, just because I really don't like playing shooters with a gamepad. So hopefully Sony's policy expands to releasing all of their games on PC as well as PlayStation, so that somebody like me who has really no interest in getting a PS5 can still enjoy those games. Although I do have to say, the saltiness from the PlayStation fanboys just freaking out over Sony games coming to PC is wonderful. So, there's that. But anyway, let's keep moving on here, because that was the end of the Summer Game Fest presentation with Jeff Keighley, and the next thing they had was the Devolver Showcase, which honestly, I didn't watch this time. I got busy during the time that it was airing, and I looked at what was announced afterwards and found really nothing all that interesting. I mean, I tried out the demo for Angerfoot later on, and I'll be talking about that when I talk about the Steam Next Fest demos, but none of the other stuff really caught my eye, so that's pretty unfortunate for them this year. Anyway, we move on to the Netflix Geeked thing, which was basically just announcing some TV shows and some mobile games. And, I mean, sure, it's cool that we're going to be getting a Dragon Age animated series, we're getting a Cyberpunk Edgerunners series, which might be kind of neat, and we are getting another series of Castlevania called Castlevania Nocturne, which looks like it'll be covering the events of Rondo of Blood, so that at least will probably be pretty neat. But there wasn't really all that much shown off during the Netflix Geeked thing that really piqued my interest. Moving on, the next big event was the Xbox and Bethesda Showcase. And oh boy, do we have some fun things here. And I use the term fun quite lightly. The first thing they showed was Redfall, that Arcane-developed vampire co-op first-person shooter, which looks horrendously uninteresting, and I'm really not looking forward to it at all, which is a real shame, because normally I look forward to the stuff that Arcane makes, but not this one. Then we had Hollow Knight Silksong, which I guess is cool if you like Hollow Knight. I haven't gotten around to it yet, but it's really not my kind of game to begin with. So I doubt I'll take a look at Silksong, but I'll probably take a look at Hollow Knight eventually, even if it's just in an MTO or a DW Plays or something like that. Anyway, moving on, we had High on Life, which I started off that trailer thinking, what the hell is this? And it was apparently by one of the makers of Rick and Morty, and that really shows. And the further it went in, the more ridiculous it got, and the more I started to think, okay, this might actually be kind of fun. So I'll keep an eye on that one, and whenever it ends up coming out, I'll see if I can give it a try and maybe do a full review on it. Then we move on to Riot bringing their games to Game Pass, which I guess is cool if you like their games, but I don't play any of their games, so I really don't care. We have A Plague Tale Requiem, which we've known about for a while. I haven't gotten around to the original yet, but it looked kinda interesting, so I'm sure I'll get around to it eventually. We had Forza Motorsport, which I do not give a single solitary shit about. We have the 40th anniversary of Microsoft Flight Sim, which I don't think people really understood how long Microsoft Flight Sim has been around, but it's been around for a very long time. And I'm really glad to see that it seems to be doing pretty well. It's not my kind of flight sim. I am much more of a space combat kind of guy. and to a lesser degree, normal combat flight sims. But whenever you see a niche product like that still managing to do pretty well for itself, and even getting some major franchise collaboration like with Halo Infinite, I mean, I know that Halo is a Microsoft franchise, but still, it's pretty cool to see that kind of thing getting implemented. And who knows, maybe Microsoft will bring back Microsoft Combat Flight Simulator, because that actually used to be a thing way back when, and they haven't made one of those in a really long time, so maybe they'll make another one of those at some point. Be kind of neat. Anyway, we continue on to Overwatch 2, which, honestly, I really don't care about. It's more Overwatch, which I stopped playing a long time ago because I got very bored with it. And Overwatch 2 seems like it's basically the same thing, so why should I be excited for it? We continue on from that to Era History Untold. At least I think that's how you're supposed to pronounce it. It's ARA History Untold, which is an upcoming strategy game which we got basically no details about, so who knows how that one will go. Then we moved on to a couple of updates from Bethesda's online games, specifically Elder Scrolls Online's High Isle expansion, which I don't care about because it's ESO, and Fallout 76, The Pit. Because clearly what Fallout 76, an absolute dumpster fire of a game, needs is new content based on a Fallout 3 DLC that barely anybody liked. Bethesda, please just do the right thing and shut down Fallout 76. It is a dumpster fire. It will never not be a dumpster fire. Please get rid of it. Anyway, let's continue on to another game that I do not care about even the slightest, which was Forza Horizon 5. I also don't care about the game that followed it, which was Ark 2, that dinosaur open-world craft survival game. Don't care about that, but hey, we got Ark 1 for free because of it, so I have that in my Steam library now, I guess. Yay? Whatever. The next game, on the other hand, though, that was one I care about, one that I've been keeping an eye on for a long time, which is Scorn, the H.R. Giger-inspired first-person shooter, which has always looked pretty cool, and after what seems like an eternity in development, it is finally getting a release later this year. Definitely going to be picking that one up. I have been looking forward to that one for a long time. After that, we have Flintlock: The Siege of Dawn, which might be kind of neat, but it looked kind of generic when I was looking at the gameplay, so I guess we'll just have to wait and see on that. And then we had Minecraft Legends, which I'm sure made some people very happy, but I'm pretty ambivalent toward it. It might be something I pick up eventually if it goes on sale for a decent price, but other than that, it's not really on my radar. Then we had Lightyear Frontier and Gunfire Reborn, which I really didn't write any notes on because apparently they were just kind of bleh. And we have The Last Case of Benedict Fox, which is probably not going to be my kind of thing. We have As Dusk Falls, which all I wrote on that is, I don't know. And Naraka Blade Point, which has been around for a while, but I've just never really gotten around to trying it, and honestly, I really don't have much desire to. Then there was Pentiment, which has a pretty cool style, but I'm really curious about how the game itself actually plays, because we didn't really get a good idea of that from the trailer. I'll definitely keep an eye on that one, though. Then they announced the full release of Grounded, which has been in early access for a while, and just, no, not my thing at all. Don't want to bother with it. We have Erebon Shadow Legacy, which looked kinda neat. We have Diablo 4, which I don't give a single solitary shit about. We have Sea of Thieves, which, again, don't really care about. I'm amazed that it's still around, honestly, and that they're still putting out content for it. We have Ravenlock, which I just put I don't know maybe as my note for that. We have Cocoon, which I just wrote meh. So, some things don't exactly elicit much remembrance or much reaction, and that's what you get. And we have Wolong Fallen Dynasty, which I think is basically like Nioh, but it's set in ancient Chinese mythology instead of Japanese. So that could be kind of neat. I mean, I still haven't finished up Nioh yet, and I'm still not entirely sure if I'll be able to, so we'll just have to wait and see on that. But I'll definitely at least put Wolong on the radar for much later on down the line if I can get it on sale for a good price or something like that. Then we had a pretty big announcement, which was the combined announcement of Persona 3 Portable, Persona 4 Golden, and Persona 5 Royal all coming to Xbox, which was pretty cool. But it wasn't just that they were all coming to Xbox, it's that Persona 3 Portable and Persona 5 Royal are both coming to PC as well via Steam, and all I have to say about that is, it's about fucking time. Now they just need to get us Persona 1 as well as Persona 2 Innocent Sin and Eternal Punishment on PC, and we'll actually have the whole series being playable again, because trying to track down a copy of Persona 1 and Persona 2 is a fucking nightmare. But even then, that would only be the Persona sub-series of Megami Tensei. There is a massive pile of Megami Tensei games that has yet to even make it to the West at all. And that's a real shame, because there's really nothing else like the Megaten series, even in Japan, at least not as far as I'm aware. And while I know that the Megaten series is relatively niche in the West, we've still been missing out on, at the very least, some of the foundational titles of the series, as well as just some of the more interesting titles of it for a very long time. So it'd be really nice if Atlus could, well, get their asses in gear and port some of those over. Still, it is good to see Persona 3 and Persona 5 coming to PC, even if Persona 3 is the PSP version, which seems a bit odd to me, but whatever. Anyway, we move on to an announcement from Hideo Kojima that he is working on a game with Xbox. That's it, that's all he announced. Whoop-de-doodle-doo. Meanwhile, even though I've had a copy of it for quite a while now, I still haven't gotten around to trying out Death Stranding, so I don't really know about a new Kojima game just yet. And then we had the big announcement of the Xbox and Bethesda Showcase, which I'm sure is going to be the big thing that a lot of you are going to be interested in. Starfield, which is literally Fallout 4 in space. Actually, I should rephrase that. It's Fallout 4 mixed with Fallout 76 in space. It is still running on the Creation Engine, aka the same engine they have been using since Morrowind. It is still clearly a massive hunk of shit, too, because even from just the gameplay footage they were showing in the 30 frames per second trailer, it was still dropping below 30 frames per second all the time. The gunplay looks near identical to Fallout 4 and 76. The third-person character animations were clearly just ripped from Fallout 76. And they couldn't even get the first-person weapon handling animations correct, because when you look at one of the weapons when they aim down the sights, the animation causes the model to start clipping, and so you see straight through the model. I mean, don't get me wrong, visual glitches aren't that big of a deal, and it really doesn't bother me that much, but it does speak to the lack of polish that they clearly have on this thing, and clearly why they delayed it another year. But think about that for a second. The company that launched Fallout 76, an unmitigated disaster of a game that even a full year after its launch was still barely playable at absolute best, decided to delay their new game. Now, I don't know about you, and obviously there is nothing I can really do to properly confirm this, because I have no insider information or anything like that, but just going off of what I know from their previous games, and the fact that they delayed Starfield, that tells me that Starfield is somehow in an even worse state than Fallout 76 was at launch. And you know what, with Todd being all, oh hey, this is the most ambitious title we've made yet, we've got thousands of planets to explore, we've got tons of content, we've got space combat, we've got full customization of your ships, and some of these features are certainly very cool, don't get me wrong, but with all of this stuff being bolted onto already a completely broken and unstable engine, I can only imagine just how jank everything is going to be when the game does eventually launch next year if they don't end up delaying it. I will be legitimately amazed if the game runs at anything remotely approaching an acceptable frame rate. I will be legitimately amazed if the game doesn't constantly crash to the point where you are experiencing more desktop than you are game. You know what? Fuck it. Honestly, at this point, I would be legitimately amazed if the game installs without problems. That is just how little confidence I have in Bethesda's ability to pull off any game release these days. When a developer has eroded my confidence in their abilities so much that I don't even expect their games to be functional software anymore, there is a serious fucking problem. And then of course there's the really sad part. Even if the game is stable, even if it runs well enough to be considered playable, I still have absolutely no confidence in their ability to pull off interesting quests, interesting story, interesting characters, or interesting gameplay. So, even though on paper Starfield seems like it could be a really interesting and cool game, I have no confidence whatsoever in Bethesda's ability to pull it off. And yet I'm still gonna take a look at it because, let's face it, if I don't, you people are going to badger me constantly until I do. So if you're wondering how I feel about Starfield, just know that I am absolutely dreading the release of Starfield at this point. But even though I'm dreading it, I'll still take a look at it at some point. I just have no idea when that'll be. Anyway, that rounds out the Xbox and Bethesda showcase, because that's what they ended that on. And then the next big event was the PC gaming show, which was weapons-grade cringe. And honestly, there was just so little of interest throughout the entire PC show that I'm just going to give you some of the highlights. Spellforce Conquest of Eos seemed kinda interesting, if only because it's taking the Spellforce series and doing a sort of Heroes of Might and Magic style spin-off. Really not sure how that'll turn out, but I'm definitely curious. Crossfire Legion, a new real-time strategy game that actually seemed kind of neat, so I'll definitely be keeping an eye on that one. Then there was The Invincible, which really only stood out for me because it reminded me a lot of David Cage, air quotes, games, where they're really just interactive movies, but the interactions are really stupid. So you'll have to press a button to reach up to something, and then press another button to grab it, and then press another button to, say, pull that lever that you've just grabbed. And then that'll open a compartment, and then you'll press another button to reach into the compartment, and another button to grab hold of an item, and then another button to pick up the item, and so on and so forth. It's just a bunch of needless nonsense interaction just for the sake of having interaction. If you're going to make something like that, just make a damn movie and be done with it. Moving on, there was also Chivalry 2 being announced as releasing on Steam. I did pick up a copy of that, and I will be taking a look at that game after I get my Elden Ring video done, which, if you're not familiar, that is going to be the next major video that I put out. And then after the Elden Ring video is done, I'm going to take a break from Souls-style games for a little while before I go back to trying to get through Neo, and then I'll try to get as far as I can into that before either doing an MTO or a full review if I manage to finish the game. And then after that, it's on to other projects. But anyways, the Chivalry 2 video will definitely be coming out after the Elden Ring video, but definitely before the Neo video, so you should probably expect that one in the next few weeks. And speaking of content coming out in the next few weeks, I'm also going to be doing a video on Outriders, which they, at the PC Gaming Show, had a bit about the upcoming World Slayer upgrade. They are currently having a free play event going on for Outriders, so I decided to go ahead and give the game a try, and at the very least do an MTO of it. I doubt I'll be able to do a full review of it just off of the free play weekend or whatever. But if I somehow end up enjoying the game enough, then I might go ahead and pick up the full version, since it is on sale as well. But I'm still not entirely sure if I want to go that route, so you'll find out whenever I end up doing the video on Outriders, so just stay tuned for that. And then moving through some of these other announcements, eventually we got to Great Houses of Calderia, which seems like a sort of fantasy Crusader Kings, which could be really interesting. So I'll probably pick that one up eventually and give it a try as well. Continuing through some of these other announcements, we eventually got a trailer for the remake of System Shock, showing off some new things, and it's still looking very good, and I still want to pick it up, and I'm still very annoyed that we still don't have a release date. Anyway, moving on, we eventually got another trailer for Scorn, which I've already talked about previously in this video, and then we got an interview about Space Marine 2, which I'm definitely looking forward to, but I'm getting tired of seeing the same CGI trailer footage and would like to see much more gameplay, maybe a release date, or release window, or something. Something other than just that one trailer we got and then people talking about the game. Because they're just going to keep saying the same crap over and over again. We wanted to be true to the original. We wanted to be true to the Warhammer 40k feel, blah, blah, blah. Like, okay, we get it. Show us the game. Let us play the game, maybe. Maybe just give us a small demo or vertical slice thing. I don't know. Whatever. Give us something other than a CGI trailer with maybe 5 or 10 seconds of gameplay footage. Anyway, moving on, we have Agent 64, Spies Never Die, which I covered in a previous video on Steam Next Fest, because they had a demo of that available, and I messed around with the demo and found it pretty interesting. So if you're interested in what I have to say about Agent 64, you can check that video out, because I actually got proper gameplay footage, and I played the demo, and it was actually pretty cool. But it does have some issues that I'm concerned about, so I'm still looking forward to the full release, just a bit cautious about it. Continuing on to other announcements, we finally got to the New Blood Interactive section where they were just being ridiculous and silly, of course, but they also showed off some things that they've been working on, a Medieval, the Black Labyrinth, which definitely looking forward to that. Ultra Kill Act 2, which I haven't covered Ultra Kill yet on the channel, but it's a pretty cool game. I'm not really good at it, but it's pretty cool, so I'll definitely be doing a video on it eventually. Was more or less waiting for that to get into its full release, though. Then we have Faith Unholy Trinity, which I still need to figure out what Faith is actually supposed to be. I've always found the art style kind of cool, but other than that, I really don't know much about it, so I really need to look further into that one. Then there was, of course, a bit about Fallen Aces, which I'm definitely looking forward to. And we had an HD update for Dusk, which is kind of cool. It basically just adds in some higher definition models and textures and such. I mean, it's cool. Not really necessary, but hey, if they're gonna do it, they might as well. And then there was a bit about Gloomwood, which all I really have to say about that is shut up and take my money. They did also mention some of the things they teased at the last Summer of Gaming event that they were part of, but all they really said about those is, hey, we're working on these things, but we're not ready to reveal anything else about them just yet. And one of those things is a Fallout-style CRPG, so I'm very, very curious about that one. But the other stuff, I can take or leave a bit. One of them's a top-down twin-stick style shooter, one of them's a car combat game. Those aren't really my kind of thing. But I could definitely use more Fallout-style CRPGs, let's put it that way. So, New Blood didn't really show us anything all that new. They just showed us refinements on things that they had already been working on and had already announced quite a while ago. But it was all welcome to see. But that was basically the end of the show for me, because the only other thing that was even kinda interesting at the PC show was Norland, which is a colony builder game, kinda styled after something like RimWorld or something along those lines. And those kinds of games are actually up my alley, it turns out. So I'm curious to see how Norland turns out, but other than that, there really wasn't anything else from the New Blood presentation on up to the end of the PC show that I really found all that interesting. So that meant that the next big thing was the Capcom showcase, where they really didn't talk about a whole lot. I mean, of course, they talked a bit about Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak, because that's something that's coming up soon. I don't really care much about the Monster Hunter series, so it doesn't really apply much to me. But then they just mentioned Street Fighter 6, didn't show anything new or interesting about it. They showed the Capcom Fighting Collection, which we've known about for a while, and definitely looking forward to that. Capcom Arcane Stadium 2, again, already talked about that. They showed some Exoprimal, which just looks like yet another third-person co-op action game. I really don't care anymore about those kinds of things, so it did basically nothing for me. Then they had a sort of two-part announcement. The first one was actually at the Capcom showcase, where they talked about the Dragon's Dogma 10th anniversary. And then they just said, hey, we're gonna have a 10th anniversary celebration video at this point later on down the line. And that's basically all they said at the event. It was stupid. There was no reason to have that at the Capcom showcase. Then the actual video happened, and the only thing we really got out of that was, hey, Dragon's Dogma 2 is finally in development. Which I guess some people might be excited about, but I don't see any reason to get excited about it, because literally the only thing they showed off was a logo. It's like, hey, here's a logo. Dragon's Dogma 2 is in development. And that's it. It was kind of pointless, honestly. So that just kind of befuddled me at the time of the Capcom showcase, and then again when the 10th anniversary video happened. But after Dragon's Dogma, then they started talking about Resident Evil. And they started with DLC for Resident Evil 8, which I haven't even picked up the basic game yet, so I guess it's good that the DLC is coming out later on down the line, and I can just pick up a complete version of the game that has all of that stuff. But I don't really care one way or another about RE8 DLC right now. They did mention that RE-Verse is going to be playable in October, and I really don't care about that at all. It's that multiplayer spin-off thing, which looks kind of dumb, but whatever. And then they talked a bit about the Resident Evil 4 remake. And let me put it this way. The trailer did not give off the vibes that I really want out of a remake of RE4. Now, here's the thing. I don't want a remake of RE4 to begin with, because I know they would fuck it up, because it's Capcom, and they do not understand their own franchise. They seem to think that Resident Evil is a serious horror franchise that is legitimately scary. It's not. It's fucking stupid. And when they roll with that, it's a lot of fun. There are only 2 Resident Evil games I've played to date that I actually got any enjoyment out of. And those are the original Resident Evil on the PS1, not the remake, because the remake takes itself way too seriously and removes the only element of the original Resident Evil that I actually enjoyed, which was the hilarious voice acting. And then there was Resident Evil 4, which after a sea of Resident Evil games that all took themselves way too seriously and seemed to think that they were legitimate horror games, decided to take it a bit back to the original style, which was a cheesy, ridiculous slasher flick kind of thing, and Leon thinks that he's an action hero. It's really silly, and it's a lot of fun because of that. But is it scary? Is it some masterpiece of horror? No, not even close. It's a decent action game with a bit of a horror twist to it, but it's certainly not a good horror game, and it seems like RE4 Remake is going way too far in the direction of turning it into a serious horror game. And I just know that if they try to turn it into a serious horror game, it is going to be garbage. So I'm really not looking forward to RE4 Remake at all. That series only works when it's not taking itself seriously and is just having fun with the silly, ridiculous nonsense. And that is just not remotely the vibe I get from the RE4 Remake trailer, so I'm fully expecting that one to be absolute trash. But after they had their bid on Resident Evil 4 Remake, they also mentioned that Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake, as well as Resident Evil 7, are all getting ports to the PS5 and Xbox Series S and X, and that there is going to be a next-gen update for PC, which is going to improve graphics and such. Whatever. Cool, I guess, but whatever. At any rate, that covers all of the Summer of Gaming announcements and showcases and such. So, with all of that out of the way, let's just go ahead and start talking about the Steam Next Fest demos that I messed around with. I unfortunately didn't get a chance to mess around with too many of those, but I did get a chance to mess around with some demos of things that I have been keeping my eye on for a while, so that's definitely a cool thing. So let's just go ahead and get things started. And we're just going to tackle these demos in alphabetical order. So I'll start with Angerfoot. This is a first-person shooter developed by Free Lives and published by Devolver Digital, and it's a pretty simple and straightforward game where you have whatever gun you happen to be carrying and the ability to kick things, and that's about it. It reminds me a lot of Hotline Miami in the sense that you go into a level and you have to just navigate through the entire thing and blast all of the enemies in your path until eventually getting to the end, and the idea is to complete the levels as quickly and efficiently as possible, which is really fun for some people and not so much for others. So this is definitely going to be a your mileage will vary kind of game, and that's made even more so by the soundtrack, which is described as a concussive bass-thumping soundtrack, which it is, and it's really not my kind of thing. It gets repetitive extremely quickly, and thus quickly becomes kind of annoying, so after a while playing Angerfoot, the music just started to grate on my nerves. But as far as the general gameplay goes, it does seem to work pretty well. It does have some performance issues, but to be fair, it's still pretty early in development, so I'm not that concerned about it at the moment. And since enemies go down in one hit and you go down in two, it makes the gameplay very fast-paced and frenetic. It's also got a very bright and colorful art style with a lot of weird exaggeration going on that gives it quite a bit of personality. So even though the soundtrack does grate on my nerves, I'll still keep an eye on the game, and once it's fully out, I'll take another look at it and either do an MTO or a full review on it if I manage to finish it. Next up, we have CULTIC, a retro-style first-person shooter developed by Jazzoz Games and published by 3D Realms. And I have been keeping my eye on this one for a long time because it looks very heavily inspired by the likes of Blood. And now that I've played the demo of it, I can say that it is shaping up very nicely. The levels are very large and expansive, there's lots of secrets to uncover, the gunplay feels pretty solid. I mean, you can get headshots and do extra damage, you have lots of very punchy weapons that feel good to use. The movement feels solid, it runs rather well, it's got the whole voxel thing going on, along with its color balancing, which gives it a pretty unique look. And all in all, it does what it sets out to achieve, be a retro-styled first-person shooter that has clear inspirations from Blood, while also still being its own thing. You see, while something like Blood or Duke Nukem 3D or all those were more or less parodies of the genres that they were mimicking, like action movies, or in the case of Blood, horror movies and slasher movies and such like that, the CULTIC isn't really trying to be funny. It definitely takes itself more seriously and is really trying to be much more of a visceral and intense first-person shooter experience, and it does manage to pull that off. So, as it stands, this demo was quite a bit of fun to play, and I am very much looking forward to the full release now. Next up, we have Deadlink, a first-person shooter mixed with roguelite elements that was developed by Groovy Entertainment and published by Super.com. And the idea here is that you control autonomous combat shells that go into areas and just basically wipe out everything in their path in an attempt to thwart the schemes of various mega corporations in a very cyberpunk-style game. And the gameplay itself is actually fairly neat. I mean, the weapons have a fair bit of impact behind them, even though a lot of enemies can be very tanky on the damage. And while the demo only had one combat shell available to you, it does have different abilities for the various shells. So the one in the demo had a sort of grapple ability where you could grab onto something and pull yourself towards it, as well as a wave attack that you could throw out and stun enemies with. And you had two weapons available, a shotgun and a rocket launcher. As you might expect, it being cyberpunk, it has a very bright and colorful art style with a lot of neon lights and things like that, as well as an electronic soundtrack that definitely fits the game pretty well. Unfortunately, however, the game suffers from one really nasty problem, and that is the roguelite elements that are supposed to set the game sort of apart from everything else. You see, procedurally generated levels are pretty boring, because they're basically just big boxes that you have to fight randomly spawning enemies in. And the rewards for continuing on and on are also randomized, so there's a very high chance that when you complete an area and have to move on to the next one, the rewards for doing so are not going to be anything that you actually need or that can actually make use of. And since playing the game is styled after roguelikes, you have to go into every single run knowing that it's going to be a one-and-done affair. There's no saving and continuing where you left off. You go in, and whenever your character ends up dying, that's when the run ends. You'll get a few resources that you can spend on upgrades for your next character, but other than that, there's not really any actual progression with it, at least not available in the demo. There may be more to it in the full version, but I'm not really going to hold my breath on that. So unfortunately, this game hits the same pitfall that just about any other roguelite first-person shooter does, which is, with randomly generated levels and randomly generated rewards being your only real progression, it's going to get pretty tiresome pretty quickly, and that's exactly what happened with even the demo of this. So I'm a bit concerned about the full version. Maybe having access to more combat shells and different abilities and such will make it more interesting, but I really don't see this one having a whole lot of longevity. I'll still keep an eye on it and still take a look at it when it does fully release though. For this next game, I have to give you a photosensitivity warning, because the constant bright flashing lights in the game, as well as just the art style in general, are going to cause problems for you if you're photosensitive or have epilepsy or some other condition like that. So if you are epileptic or have issues with photosensitivity, then go ahead and skip ahead to the timecode that I'm showing on the screen right now, or use the timecodes that are present in the video description box as well as the pinned comment in order to skip to the next game, because this particular one had severe enough issues with that even though I have no real issues with photosensitivity, it gave me a massive headache to play, so you have been warned. So, now that you have been sufficiently warned about this particular game, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about it. The next demo I took a look at, which is a game I was keeping an eye on for quite a while, is Hellscreen. This is by UK_Resistant, and it's a retro-style first-person shooter where the main gimmick is that you have a sort of rear-view mirror up at the very top of the screen, and you can switch that into a much larger view, and you can use that to see enemies that you can't normally see otherwise, and attack enemies that you can't normally attack otherwise, as well as just keep an eye on what's going on behind you at all times. And it's an interesting gimmick, and it actually works pretty well. The problem is that I couldn't play the game for longer than a few minutes before it became too painful to continue, and I mean that quite literally. This game basically burns out your retinas with its art style and the constant flashing on screen, and in the demo at least, there was absolutely nothing we could do to try to tone that down. So, if this game releases with no ability to tune down the bright flashing and to tune down the art style a bit so that it's not painful to look at, then it's not going to matter how neat that gimmick is or how well it actually plays as a first-person shooter, because if a game is painful to play, then there's no reason to play it. Next up, we have a demo that technically wasn't part of Steam Next Fest, but it was close enough to it that I decided to bundle it with them. And that game is Metal Hellsinger, developed by The Outsiders and published by Funcom. And this is actually a bit of a follow-up to something I said in an MTO fairly recently that covered several different games, and one of those games was BPM Bullets Per Minute, which was that while BPM really didn't do much for me because it was very heavily predicated on the roguelite stuff, the rhythm-based first-person shooter concept seemed really interesting, and I was curious what a game like Metal Hellsinger does with it, considering that Metal Hellsinger is more of a structured, proper first-person shooter, as opposed to just, here, have a bunch of boxes that are randomly generated with randomly generated enemies in them. Well, I can say that this game is a bit easier to mess up than BPM is. In BPM, if you don't hit something on a beat, it just doesn't do anything. Whereas in this, hitting enemies and attacking on the beat gives you a damage bonus, it improves your fury gauge, which as it continues to go up will also affect the music, which gets more intense as the fury gauge goes up, and eventually it will kick in with the vocals when it maxes out. And in general, it definitely feels like a much smoother gameplay experience than what you see in the likes of BPM. Unfortunately, however, there is a significant problem with the game, and it's mostly a personal issue with this. And that is that even though the metal soundtrack that this has is actually pretty solid while it's playing the instrumentals and such, and when the female vocals kick in, it's fine. When the male vocals kick in, it's the exact kind of metal vocals that I fucking hate. That growling and screaming that you hear in most modern metal. Which makes me not want to listen to most modern metal, because I can really get into the instrumental stuff, but as soon as that growling and screaming kicks in, I'm like, nope, I don't want to listen to this anymore. And that's exactly the kind of thing that happens with Metal Hellsinger. I'll be getting in the groove with all of the instrumental stuff, and then I'll hit the max fury gauge, and it'll kick in with the vocals, and I'll be like, I kind of don't want to play this anymore. So the weird part is, if I want to enjoy the game, I basically have to play it in a suboptimal manner and not max out the fury gauge so that I don't have to listen to that obnoxious growling and screaming. I know that might sound petty and weird to you, but it's a simple fact that whenever I'm listening to any kind of metal that has those kinds of vocals, I'll be enjoying the instrumental stuff, and as soon as those vocals will kick in, I will just stop enjoying that song entirely. It is incredibly frustrating. And the same kind of thing happens with Metal Hellsinger. I'll be playing it, I'll be enjoying the instrumental stuff, I'll be starting to get into the groove and getting that beat down, and then the vocals will kick in once the fury gauge maxes out, and my enjoyment of the game just plummets. And unfortunately, the music is an integral part of the game, because again, this is a rhythm-based first-person shooter, not just a first-person shooter, so it's not like I can just turn the music off and get the same kind of experience. So honestly, I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen when this game fully releases. I'll probably still take another look at it, but if I can't just force myself through all of those growling and screaming vocals, then I don't see myself being able to finish the game and doing a full review on it. We'll just have to wait and see, though. Next up, we have a game that I've been keeping my eye on for a long time, which is Selaco. This is a first-person shooter by Altered Orbit Studios that runs on the GZ Doom engine, which is a modified version of the original Doom engine, and the kind of spectacle they've been able to pull off with even an engine that old is incredibly impressive. This thing plays a lot like Fear in the sense that you have a ludicrous amount of carnage going on in the environments whenever you get into a firefight with enemies. There's also blood and gore, there's very punchy, powerful feeling weapons, and even the AI takes cues from Fear, where they'll try to flush you out from cover you're hiding behind, they'll constantly be chattering back and forth to each other, and as the fight continues to progress, they'll get more and more panicked as more of them go down. And it really does manage to capture that same feeling of the combat in Fear, where you go into an area and you just lay waste to the entire area as the firefight progresses. It's actually a pretty challenging game, too. I only played it on the medium setting because I was trying to get an idea how the baseline goes. And even on that setting, if I wasn't paying attention, I would go down fairly quickly. So they've definitely tuned this to be a bit more of a difficult first-person shooter. And the end result there is you do end up playing this a bit more tactically than you would most other retro-styled first-person shooters, where in most of those other games you kind of run in guns blazing, do a lot of circle strafing, that kind of thing. Here you need to play more carefully, so you're going to be darting in and out of cover, you're going to be timing when you run in guns blazing to make sure that you can do a lot of damage and not take all that much in return. And when that's all firing on all cylinders, this game is an absolute blast. And on top of all of that, it's still a retro-style first-person shooter, so you still have secret areas where you can find resources that you might desperately need, or which might give you a massive advantage in an upcoming fight, or of course find certain weapons early and then lay waste to your foes with them. So I was already keeping my eye on Selaco and looking forward to it before the demo came out, but now that I've played the demo, I definitely want the full version now, and I very highly recommend that if any of you out there are even the slightest bit interested in Selaco, definitely give that demo a try, because it's looking like that's one of the few demos that is sticking around. And the last demo I took a look at for Steam Next Fest is We Who Are About to Die. This is a gladiatorial roguelite hack-and-slash game by Jordi Lakir. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, so I apologize if I'm not. But anyway, the idea is actually pretty simple. You control a gladiator, and between the bouts of fighting, you're going to be improving your training, you're going to be improving your equipment, you're going to, of course, be healing up. And you have permadeath, so once your character dies, then you have to start the entire thing over again from the beginning. And while I really can't say I'm a fan of the roguelike stuff, because I'm just not a fan of that in any game that it's in, it's generally a pretty neat idea. I mean, we don't really get a whole lot of gladiator games, and we certainly don't get a whole lot where you control a gladiator that's going through a career and you're trying to improve things like that. But this particular demo did fall short on a couple of key aspects. The first of them being performance. It just did not run well at all, and that's going to cause pretty severe problems when you have a physics-based action combat system like this has, which is certainly a very cool idea. The only other game I can think of off top of my head with something very similar to that would be Exanima, which, if you're not familiar with it, is basically a dungeon-crawling RPG-ish kind of thing that's been in development for about a decade at this point, with absolutely no end in sight to said development, and it's supposed to be the prologue of a much bigger game, so who knows how ridiculously long it'll take for the full game, air quotes, to actually come out. But suffice to say, We Who Are About to Die puts itself in a very good spot as far as being unique goes. The problem is that not only is the performance really rough, thus resulting in any kind of action combat being adversely affected, but the physics-based combat itself just feels incredibly clunky. It is very difficult to get used to that, and as you're sitting there flailing around, it's very difficult to tell exactly why you're doing a lot of damage or why you're not doing much damage, or what's actually being blocked versus what isn't being blocked, and it's just very difficult to tell exactly how much damage you're doing to an opponent until eventually they just fall over. So, while it's certainly an interesting idea, The system needs a lot of refinement to make it a lot more user-friendly, and they definitely need to fix that performance up, because as it stands, the game was barely playable. Those are things that can certainly be improved by the time the game launches, whether it be into early access or in full, so I'm not really worried about it that much at this stage. This is still very much an alpha demo. But those are some pretty fundamental issues, so hopefully they get those sorted out very quickly, because otherwise, this is definitely an interesting game, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing more from it. And that wraps up pretty much everything I had to say about the Steam Next Fest demos and the Summer of Gaming, at least that I can think of off the top of my head anyway. If there's anything I completely missed or something you have more questions about, feel free to leave a comment and I'll get to those when I can. But as far as the whole Summer of Gaming event goes, a lot of the announcements and such were really not all that interesting, which is really not all that surprising for E3 style events. But since it's looking like a lot of the upcoming releases that I'm really interested in are quite a long ways out, I'll have some time to catch up on some existing projects, some games that I've been messing around with for a while and just haven't gotten around to finishing yet, so on and so forth. And hopefully by the time some of those particularly big releases come out, I will have built a new PC by then and will be able to take advantage of much more advanced hardware than what I'm currently running, which is really starting to hit its limits at this point. So we'll just have to wait and see how everything goes. There are certainly some newer titles coming out that are going to give my rig a hard time, so I'm probably going to hold off on those until I get the new hardware. And there are some titles that I've been trying to work on, but which are really not working all that well with my current rig, so I'll probably end up having to push some of those back as well. Stuff like, say, Cyberpunk 2077 or Deathloop, both of which run like absolute garbage on my rig, so even with updates supposedly improving performance, they're still barely playable. So I'll probably end up pushing those back to whenever I end up getting that new hardware and building the new PC. Although at this point I really don't know when that's going to be, because I am waiting on the next generation of hardware to see if it's a substantial upgrade over the previous one, and if it is, then I'll try to opt for the latest hardware so I can kind of future-proof my rig, in massive air quotes there, for a few more years than if I were to go with the current gen. So we'll see how all that goes, but between then and now, I've got plenty of other projects to work on, including the next major video that will be pretty soon, hopefully within the next few weeks, which is Elden Ring. So that's going to be the next major project, but until then, you can expect some more DW Plays videos, or my thoughts on style videos of smaller things, maybe multi-game MTOs or that sort of thing, at least until I sort out the Elden Ring video, because that one's a bigger undertaking. So I appreciate your patience with all the delays I've had to do on things like that. I appreciate your patience on the delays I've had to do with this particular video, because it ended up taking a lot longer than I thought it would to edit and compile and everything. And just in general, thank you all very much for watching and sticking with me throughout this whole video. Thanks again to those of you who support the channel on Patreon. Again, all the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, and now that I'm working towards building a new PC, that's what that's going towards. If you're wanting to take a look at any of the games I covered in the Steam Next Fest demos, links are all in the video description box, and you can go check those out. Some of them still have the demos available, some of them don't, but you can still keep an eye on them, throw them in your wish list, that sort of thing. And now that I've got this video taken care of, I'm going to go ahead and get back to working on the Elden Ring video, as well as things that will come out in between then and now. So thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.